Before I begin, this video is a follow-up to my Quest 64 review. It's a bit old and it's not essential viewing, but I do recommend it. Links in the description. Quest 64 is despised for having the weight of the world on its shoulders and failing to carry. Being the first RPG to grace the Nintendo 64, it was tasked with carving a path for the future of role-playing on the barren system. And I think we all know how that turned out. Despite good enough sales to toy around with the idea, a true sequel was ultimately scrapped. However, in its place arose two separate titles: Quest Fantasy Challenge and Quest RPG Brian's Journey, both releasing after the 64 original and both for the Game Boy Color. I'll start with Fantasy Challenge because there's not a lot to say. It's a maze game where you play as Brian and burrow through the ground for gems while narrowly dodging enemies. You can blast them with magic, drop chests on them, or turn it off because it's shit. With a total of 20 levels and a clunky boss fight every 5 stages, it's a horrible clone of the arcade classic Mr. Do, and a complete waste of time. Alright, so the running tally for the series is 2 bad games out of 3. Not to shit on Quest 64, but the negatives definitely outweigh the positives, and it didn't exactly set the world on fire. So the lingering question remains: is Brian's Journey a hidden gem kept obscured by a cruel fate? Is it a game so well structured and enjoyable that it validates the entire series in spite of the heavy setbacks? Nah, it's almost an identical recreation of Quest 64, only with a lower bit count, which is actually quite impressive considering the system, and brave considering the reception to the original. While it is a demake, there are some minor differences in narrative events, and the opening is an apt example. Midway through his first year at Hogwarts, Brian's informed that the L-Tale book has been dispossessed, and while searching for leads, our budding protagonist finds himself at the blade's end of an assassin. After which, he's ordered by the Grand Abbot to embark on his own journey in pursuit of his father, the aforementioned book, and some true and honest gal pals. These events make more sense in the original, as Brian's daddy went AWOL before the game began, but in this version, he's seen rooting a sheep moments before Brian sets off. It's the first in a series of events that aren't given enough time to breathe, where it feels like plot points go unresolved because there's no weight to anything. Other changes to the story take the form of a more involved circle of NPCs who aid in progression, as well as Brian occasionally interjecting with some interesting English. While these additions aren't fantastic, they do seem like an attempt to mend one of the major flaws in the original game, in that the world has lore and characters had motivations, but none of it seemed connected or important. The patchwork job was an attempt, signaling that it may have been a development focus and simply fell short. One example that actually stood out as a positive change was a scene wherein a bandit troop kidnap a princess in front of Brian's virgin eyes, which gives you an actual motivation to pursue because you're fangin' for that royal puss. Contrast this with the original game, in which Brian gives chase because a king loosely mentions that he lost his bowl in a forest. Overall, the most glaring difference is the visual style and how that translates to gameplay. Obviously, the handheld system's quite gimped compared to the Nintendo 64, but the top-down reimagining of maps and the lack of rudimentary 3D camera has made them much easier to comprehend and navigate. That said, the limited viewing window does make larger maps feel a bit excessive and uninspired, and blindingly details the lack of one of Quest 64's best features, that being the utilization of 3D space and the guidance through object placement. To briefly reiterate what I spoke about in my Quest 64 video, the game's quite empty, in that there's plenty of expansive maps filled with sweet fuck all. However, the world contains sporadically placed spirits, and collecting them grants the player a level up to any element. These are incredibly valuable as they smooth out the progression curve, and by featuring an insane draw distance, they beckon the player to the point of interest, giving them a tangible short-term goal in an otherwise empty world. Due to the limitations of the modest handheld, the spirits couldn't be implemented in the same way, which makes stumbling upon them underwhelming, and the rate they're required feels more like an entitlement than a reward. The best Brian's Journey can offer is situating them amid a standard JRPG labyrinth, putting a few extra steps between you and something you don't really need, as level ups pay out every few battles. I don't know how this could be improved given the circumstances, but it does showcase how Quest 64 benefits from being a 3D title, where a similar approach in a lesser dimension fails to accurately capture the experience. While some maps are better than others in their execution, the tiles themselves are incapable of replicating that signature Nintendo 64 style of stretched, low-res textures and dangerously sharp polygons. Plenty of maps are quite faithful, but the 2D implementation relies a little too heavily on the safety net of generic JRPG design. As bland as they are, the worst I can say is that they're just okay, which, honestly, for an old JRPG is kind of a compliment. Traversal itself is also not too bloated, as the encounter rate is far from excessive, and Brian starts combat on the borders of the screen, enabling a swift, guaranteed opportunity to flee. It also features the teleport system from the original, where arriving at a town allows you to warp to it, with some interesting restrictions. Wings are an expendable item acquired at each town, and upon use transport the player back to their respective locale, but with an inventory cap of 1, every time you teleport they have to be recollected. It's not a huge issue, but the game would lose nothing by simply unlocking them as you enter a town and making them reusable. Also, why, in this magical world, does a wizard need fucking doodads to teleport? Wings were slightly improved in Brian's journey, casting aside the former restrictions of only being usable on the world map, they can now be activated anywhere. If there were any reason to explore outside of padding your inventory full of single-use buff items, this would be a fantastic change. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call a neg. On the subject of inventory, there's quite a few items for such a simple game. In addition to healing, there's buffs and debuffs, and actually I think that's it. I'm not even sure if many of these items are viable, as they don't feature an in-game description and can only be found in chests, as Keltland is not a capital-driven society. In addition to not knowing what items do, or them being accessible enough to figure out, there's also no option to discard them, so if you hit the inventory limit, shit has to be burned in battle to make room for more potentially useless shit. Enemies also drop items now, so inventory flooding is a serious issue, though it is nice to be able to forage outside the, bread lines.
Death is a preferable alternative to communism.
Another interesting change is that MP no longer restores as you walk, as it does in the 64 version. The only way to get it back outside of resting or recovery items is by taking a turn not casting magic in battle. If a turn's passed or a melee action's taken, MP goes up by 1, which is fairly worthless, as melee isn't exactly a huge element to combat, and burning turns is a waste of time. The original managed this better, as it gave you enough MP recovery to not constantly break up gameplay with required in-trips or potion chugging. It also managed this without tipping the scales too far in the other direction, as the means to recover it was moving around in monster-infested areas. It wasn't without its flaws, but when used as intended, it made forward motion a bit more forgiving, and it's a shame that it was replaced with a borderline unusable system because of the unbalanced nature of melee. While we're on the subject of combat, it no longer takes place on the world map and is split off into its own battle scene, which functions more or less the same as the Chad 64 version, but much like everything else in Brian's journey, suffers for various reasons. Both titles have a turn-based combat system with real-time elements, where the player and enemy alternate turns, but Brian regains real-time control as foes cast their spells, and can use this window to dodge. There is a clear divide between battle styles in that 64's seamless transition from traversal to combat allowed it to retain the same movement, offering a level of consistency required to make split-second decisions. The 2D battle scenes have a completely different control scheme, which doesn't take a lot of getting used to, but that lack of consistency, coupled with how hitboxes function, make it difficult to maneuver Brian in the same way. Being three-dimensional, Quest 64 was much clearer in conveying the space a spell or character would occupy, which made it feel natural when reacting. Unfortunately for the demake, the lack of a Z-axis confines the system to awkward spacing and movement, and the odd hitboxes don't help either. When Brian touches the sprite of a spell effect, it causes damage, but because height can't be properly displayed and conceptualized on a flat battle scene, this means that spells which should otherwise not make contact very much do. With airborne effects often coming from the top of the screen, it's more consistent to dodge to the bottom, but dodging distance is also tougher to judge because of these limitations, where a falling sprite may descend all the way to the bottom with no indication on how it'll behave. If the airborne sprites had shadows beneath them to convey where they'd land, or didn't damage Brian while they were airborne, it would have worked far better. That said, most spells are homing or undodgeable because of the small battle arena and restrictive movement space, so attempts are generally worthless anyway. It's much easier to cast Spirit Shield, reducing all incoming damage to 1 and just roll the game, much like its older brother with Magic Barrier. Outside of those glaring issues, the combat fundamentals function pretty well, where each party can move around and cast spells relatively unhindered. However, most spells do insane amounts of damage, and because of the inaccurate hitboxes, they can be exploited to do significantly more damage than intended, which makes almost every enemy in the game a complete joke. One of the few exceptions to this is the final boss, who has a bunch of homing attacks that wreck your shit unless you outspeed him, or performed enough fisticuffs to have a respectable health pool. Getting to the end of the game will see you with quite low HP, as the only way to increase it is with physical attacks, by either executing or receiving them. However, being a magic-focused game, only a few enemies actually use physical attacks, and because magic's so OP, enemies generally die before you get to biff them. The only point in the game where I was underpowered was the final boss. As he one-shot me, I went back to grind my speed in order to pop off the Spirit Shield ability before he could just decimate me, and then I proceeded to steamroll him with my own overpowered magic. The synergistic combos from the former title return, only refined as every element's now viable instead of just water and earth. Water is still essential for healing, and coupled with earth it gives you the Spirit Shield to prevent damage, but both fire and wind carried me through most of the game in terms of damage output. Even a fire-water combo or a water-wind combo would do huge damage, which is a good sign that attempts were made to balance elements. The game gives you enough level ups and spirits to max every element with ease, so there's no real need to specialize past the mid-game, and all spell combos are unlocked with around 25 points in each, so it seems the cap of 50 was really just for small damage bumps. Outside of that, it's more or less the same as the original, where there's a magic menu, elements are bound to a direction, and they're used in specific sequences to create new, more powerful spells. This system is a great concept, but both games needed their own big adjustments to match the difficulty curves, and maybe even some tweaks to how combat works and how stats are gained. Playing through Brian's journey made me genuinely wish that the Quest 64 sequel was realised, because I think a second attempt on the same hardware would have given us a really refined game. It is a shame that what we got was a horrible clone of Mr. Do and a demake unable to capture what little Quest 64 actually got right. Ah, well, sometimes shit just, doesn't turn out the way you plan. Or it does and it's bad. Thanks for watching.